Welcome to our newest episode about the Vietnam War. Subscribe our channel and enjoy. The origins of the Vietnam War can be traced back to the end of World War II, when France reoccupied its former colony of Indochina, which included Vietnam. The Vietnamese, led by communist revolutionary Ho Chi Minh, began fighting for their independence from France in 1946. This conflict continued until 1954, when the French were defeated at the Battle of Dien. The Geneva Accords of 1954 temporarily divided Vietnam into two parts, the Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the non-Communist South, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. The agreement called for nationwide elections to be held in 1956 to reunify the country, but these never took place due to Diem's refusal to participate. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, communist rebels, known as the Viet Cong, began attacking the South Vietnamese government and its American advisors. The United States began to increase its military presence in Vietnam to support the South Vietnamese government, first by sending advisors and later by committing combat troops. By the mid-1960s, the conflict had escalated into a full-scale war between the communist forces of North Vietnam and the United States and its allies in the South. The war continued until 1975, when North Vietnamese forces captured the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon and reunified the country under communist rule. The Vietnam War was part of the larger Cold War conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union and China provided military and economic assistance to North Vietnam, while the United States supported the South Vietnamese government and its military forces. The conflict was seen as a battleground between the two superpowers, with the United States and its allies seeking to prevent the spread of communism and the Soviet Union and its allies supporting communist movements and governments around the world. The Cold War context greatly influenced the strategies and decisions of both sides in the Vietnam War, and the conflict became a symbol of the larger geopolitical struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Vietnam War resulted in the deaths of many civilians, including women and children. The conflict was fought largely in rural areas, where many Vietnamese civilians lived and worked, and the fighting often caused widespread destruction and displacement. Civilians on both sides of the conflict were caught in the crossfire, and many were killed or injured as a result. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces often used guerrilla tactics and unconventional weapons, such as landmines and booby traps, which posed a significant risk to civilians. The American military, meanwhile, used air power and artillery to target enemy forces, which sometimes led to civilian casualties. The impact of the war on Vietnamese civilians was devastating. The war resulted in the deaths of an estimated 1.5 to 3 million Vietnamese civilians, and it also caused widespread displacement and suffering. Many Vietnamese civilians were forced to flee their homes and villages, and they faced a range of challenges, including food shortages, disease, and exposure to the elements. The impact of the war on American civilians was also significant. The conflict was deeply divisive and controversial, and it sparked widespread protests and unrest in the United States. Many Americans were outraged by the human cost of the war, and they called for an end to American involvement in Vietnam. The war also had a profound impact on the military and political landscape of the United States, and it continues to influence American foreign policy and military strategy to this day. The Vietnam War was largely fought in jungle and rural areas, particularly in the mountainous regions of Vietnam, which provided natural cover for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. The dense jungle and rugged terrain made it difficult for the American military to navigate and engage the enemy, and it also provided the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong with natural cover for their guerrilla tactics. The Vietnam War was fought in a variety of different environments, including dense jungles, rice paddies, coastal regions, and urban areas. However, much of the fighting took place in remote rural areas, where both sides engaged in a brutal and protracted conflict. The jungle terrain also posed significant challenges for the American military in terms of logistics, transportation, and communication, as well as the health and well-being of soldiers deployed in the region. The difficult terrain and environment of the Vietnam War contributed to the high number of casualties on both sides, and it also had a significant impact on the tactics and strategies employed by the military forces involved. To navigate the challenges of the jungle and rural areas, both sides had to adapt their tactics and equipment, resulting in a complex and dynamic conflict that tested the limits of modern warfare. The Vietnam War was fought using a combination of conventional and guerrilla warfare tactics. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces primarily relied on guerrilla tactics, such as ambushes, booby traps, and hit-and-run attacks, to combat the more powerful and better-equipped American forces. These tactics allowed the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong to effectively engage in asymmetric warfare, in which a smaller and less well-equipped force uses unconventional tactics to fight a larger and more powerful force. In addition to guerrilla warfare tactics, both sides also engaged in conventional warfare, using tanks, artillery, and other heavy weaponry. The United States used air power extensively, launching bombing campaigns against North Vietnam and targeting the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of supply routes used by the North Vietnamese to transport troops and supplies to the south. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong also had access to Soviet and Chinese military equipment, which they used to engage in conventional warfare against American and South Vietnamese forces. The combination of conventional and guerrilla warfare tactics made the Vietnam War a complex and challenging conflict for both sides, and contributed to the high number of casualties and the extended duration of the war. The use of helicopters was a key aspect of American military strategy during the Vietnam War. Helicopters were used for a wide range of missions, including transport, reconnaissance, medical evacuation, and combat support. They allowed the military to rapidly move troops and equipment to different parts of the battlefield, and they also provided aerial cover for ground troops. The widespread use of helicopters during the Vietnam War marked a significant shift in military tactics and strategy. Helicopters allowed the military to project force in new and innovative ways, and they also provided a level of flexibility and mobility that was previously unavailable. However, the use of helicopters also exposed American troops to new risks and challenges, as the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces developed new tactics and weapons to target helicopters. The use of helicopters in the Vietnam War also had a profound impact on the cultural and social landscape of the United States. The iconic image of helicopters descending on the jungle battlefield became synonymous with the conflict, and it has since become a powerful symbol of the sacrifices made by American soldiers during the war. The use of helicopters in the Vietnam War also inspired a new generation of military tactics and strategies, and it continues to influence military thinking and doctrine to this day. The Vietnam War was the longest war in American history until the war in Afghanistan, which began in 2001 and is ongoing. The Vietnam War officially began in 1955 and lasted until 1975, a period of 20 years. During that time, the United States and its allies engaged in a prolonged conflict against the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, in what was one of the most divisive and controversial conflicts in American history. The length of the Vietnam War contributed to the high number of casualties and the significant financial and human costs associated with the conflict. The prolonged nature of the war also had a profound impact on American society, leading to widespread protests and social unrest, as well as political divisions that lasted for many years. The war in Afghanistan has now surpassed the Vietnam War in terms of duration, but the legacy of the Vietnam War continues to be felt in the United States and around the world. The Vietnam War was a complex and controversial conflict that had a significant impact on the people and nations involved. It was fought using a range of conventional and unconventional tactics, and it resulted in the deaths of millions of people, both military personnel and civilians. The use of helicopters and other innovative military strategies marked a significant shift in the way wars were fought, and the war also had a profound impact on the cultural and political landscape of the United States. Today, the Vietnam War remains an important chapter in world history, and it serves as a reminder of the human cost of conflict and the importance of diplomacy and peace-building efforts. Thank you for watching, subscribe our channel and see you in next episodes.